Hello everyone, it's Shannon here for Honeybee Stamps. In today's video, we're going to create this sweet winter card featuring the Merry Little Mice stamp set. We'll also make this wonderful watercolor background with the Emboss Resist technique. We're going to start by making the background. I'm using the new Falling Snow background stamp set. It's a 6x6 stamp, and I'm going to stamp it onto an A2 panel of watercolor paper. I'm going to arrange the stamp in my MISTI here because I'm going to stamp it a couple times to make sure I get enough of that Watermark ink on there. I'm going to place a little bit of tape on the back side of my panel so I can center it inside that stamp. And once I get it in place, I'll press it down. And now I'm going to apply some anti-static powder because I am going to do some heat embossing, and then ink up my stamp in VersaMark ink, which again is a watermark ink or embossing ink. Just use my cloth here to kind of press all over to get a good impression, and then I'll just ink it up one more time and stamp it a second time. Again, just to make sure I have enough of that ink on there because this is a watercolor panel, so it's watercolor paper and it just has more tooth, so sometimes it's harder to get a better impression. Now I'm just going to dip my panel into some white embossing powder. I'm going to use a little scrap paper here to also help me get this whole panel completely covered with that embossing powder. Once it's covered, I'll then heat set it, of course, with my heat gun, which I'll grab here. Just go over and heat set all of that embossing powder, and that embossing powder will create a awesome resist, and this will keep all those snowflakes and that snow nice and white, even though we're going to watercolor right on top of it. I'm going to be using Gansai Tambi watercolors. I really like how bold they are. I have 4 colors picked out, 34, 57, 63, and 139. I'm going to spritz some water over the pan of watercolor, and then I'll grab my brush and just kind of mix it up. I'm going to start with my darkest shade here and just color or just paint about a quarter of this with that dark shade. Then I will clean my brush and then move on to my next shade. This is kind of a blue color, and I'll paint again another kind of quarter, so about halfway down on this panel, and I'll mix a little bit here and there with the previous color just to start to get in kind of a cool ombre look. And I did paint this directly onto a dry panel. I didn't wet my panel first. You can definitely do kind of the wet on wet technique, but I think the dry is fine too. Moving on to a purple and then a pink, and now I'm just going back over, cleaning my brush in between here and there, kind of mixing the colors a little bit between so they transition nicely from one to the next. And that actually completes my panel, and here it is all nice and dry. But now that my panel is dry, I do have some of that watercolor left over on the heat embossed area, so I'm going to grab my towel here. Now it's dry, but I am kind of pressing my finger through the towel onto my damp chamois, which is off camera, so I'm getting my towel just the tiniest bit wet. You want to avoid really wet towel or even a really damp chamois for this, because if you start wiping with a damp chamois, or a damp towel, you'll obviously be picking up your actual watercolor off of the watercolor paper and not just the heat embossing. So be careful when you kind of clean up a little bit. So now that I finished cleaning that up, I'm going to create a little snow slope. So I have a 4 1/4 width piece of paper, and I just hand cut a little kind of slope on it. Now I'm going to ink blend the bottom portion with Salvaged Patina Distress Oxide just to add a little shadow, a little bit of color. It's a really light color and kind of brings out some of the teals in that watercolor background. Now that that's done, we're going to move on to our images. I have the Merry Little Mice stamp set. This is a super adorable little set. I love it. I pulled off 2 mice as well as a little snowman mouse, or a little mouse snowman. I'm going to ink them up in intense black ink and then just stamp them on to this scrap of Neenah Solar White cardstock. And now I'm ready to Copic color these images. I'm going to start with the mouse, and I'm going to use like a darker combo for his body, starting with W3, so kind of it's a warm gray for his body. Then I moved on to W5 to kind of create a shadow, and then I'll go back to that W3 and kind of blend out that transition between the W5 and the W3. Now I'm going to move on to his little snout. I have W1 and W3 picked out, the W1 for the whole snout and then a little W3 to add a shadow. And then after I finished that, I felt like I didn't have enough contrast, so I went up one more marker. I'm using W7, kind of beefing up the dark, and then W5, and then back to W3 to just kind of blend it out. And that just makes the body of the mouse a little bit darker, so you have more contrast between the body and the little snout. Now moving on to the inner part of the ears, I'm just using RV11 and then blending it out with Zero or a colorless blender. Now moving on to my other little mouse, I'm going to color him exactly the same, so I just did that off camera. Now that I've finished with that mouse, I'm going to move on to our little snowman. Starting with the hat, I'm going to use W5 and W7, so again using those warm grays just to kind of keep my color palette minimal and more consistent. After I finished blending that, I did the little buttons as well. Then I'm going to move on to that little ribbon around his hat, and I have BG13 and BG49, just do a little blend there on that ribbon. And then for the body of the mouse, because it's a snowman, I'm just using a really light blue, coloring kind of a shadow, and then blending it out with my colorless blender. And that will actually complete my coloring. Now I'm going to move on to a white gel pen and just add a little glare or a little shine mark. I always choose areas that are kind of darker to add that shine mark. So again, I have that contrast so you can really see that white line. And now that I finished adding that line, the gel pen accents, I went ahead and die cut them out with the matching dies. And now we're going to move on to our sentiment. I have the Merry Christmouse stamp set. I'm going to stamp a sentiment from that set onto a scrap of black cardstock. I put down some anti-static powder, inked it up with VersaMark ink, and now I'm dipping it into some white embossing powder, and then I'll heat set with my heat tool. Once I've heat set that, I'll then use the matching dies. I love when sentiment stamp sets have matching dies, and then go ahead and die cut that sentiment out. Now we're ready to move on to kind of pulling it all together. I'm going to start by adding some liquid adhesive to the back side of my watercolor panel and go ahead and stick it down onto an A2 top folding white card base. I'll use my plate for my die cutting machine to kind of weight it down while that glue sets up a little bit. Now I'm going to start to put together my images and my slope. Added a piece of foam adhesive to the back side of my snow slope, and now I'm just going to glue my images right onto that slope, just adding a little bit of glue to the bottom portion of all of my images, my little snowman and my mice. Once I've got those stuck down, I'm then going to flip my sentiment over and my images over, and I'm going to add some more foam adhesive. So I'm just going to speed it up here to really to just move past this part a little bit. And now that I've added the foam adhesive to the back side of everything, I'm going to remove the backing and stick it down, starting with my cute little slope and my little mice. I'm just going to stick that down to the bottom portion of my card front, and then remove the backing on my sentiment and kind of place that on the upper left. And that will actually complete my card. And I'll hold it to the camera so you can get a good look at all the details in this really cute card. I love that bold watercolor background. It has lots of texture and depth and just really pretty with those colors. And of course the mice and the snowman are just so cute, and the sentiment really just kind of grounds it and polishes it off. I hope you guys enjoyed today's card and video. If any questions about the products I use, please check out the links below in the description. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a wonderful day.